Welcome to Complex Creatures, exploring spirituality and the common good.
When I was a kid, I remember seeing a book on my parents' shelf that always caught my attention. The Catechism of the Catholic Church. Its size, the look of it, even that word, catechism. It all felt exotic, ancient, and inherently meaningful. Catechism, catechesis, catechumenate, catechetical theology. What do all these words mean, and why should people with spiritual conviction care? Broadly speaking, when we talk about catechisms, we're talking about a way of being trained into a faith tradition. But it's not just education in the sense of absorbing information or concepts. Catechesis isn't merely about knowing, it's about becoming. It is meant to form people into a way of life. Yes, catechesis involves learning, memorization, and instruction, but more deeply than that, it is about being steeped transformatively into the depths of a tradition. Existentially, it's about becoming rooted in what grows out of rootedness, renewal. Catechetical work is soul work. Today on Complex Creatures, we welcome Dr. Alex Fogleman. Dr. Fogleman is Associate Dean for Special Programs and Assistant Professor of Theology at Trinity Anglican Seminary, where he oversees the Robert E. Weber Center and Doctor of Ministry program. He also directs the Catechesis Task Force for the Anglican Church in North America. He is author of Knowledge, Faith, and Early Christian Initiation, which is published by Cambridge University Press, and Making Disciples, Catechesis in History, Theology, and Practice, published by Eerdmans in 2025. It's the second book that we're focusing on today. Alex comes from the Anglican Church in North America, a tradition called ACNA. It's at once ancient and liturgical, rooted in the broad Anglican heritage of the Church of England, while also deeply evangelical in its energy, its emphasis on personal transformation, and its call to a living faith. We didn't have long with Alex, so we got right to the heart of catechesis and why it matters, and what it does, and how it can help form spiritually mature people for life and faith today and tomorrow. I'm grateful for his work, and I expect much more good to come from him. If you want to grow deeper roots in the ancient traditions of Christian faith and experience genuine spiritual renewal, I highly recommend this book. Enjoy the conversation. So your book is titled Making Disciples, which sounds deceptively simple. What problem or gap did you see or have you seen in the church's life that made you think this book was needed at this time?
Yeah, that's a good question. The title "Making Disciples" is partially because people still don't know what catechesis is, and publishers don't want to try to sell a book that has the word catechesis in it. So it got moved to the subtitle, which is totally fine. But I actually like the title "Making Disciples" better than I originally thought I would, because it speaks to this kind of foundation laying. Like, it's not everything you may want to say about disciples or discipleship, but it does get at that, like, what is the making of? Like, what's at the root of that? How do things get off and running well? And so it's thinking a lot of the book deals with a kind of like foundations language, and that's kind of a lot of some of the thinking around catechesis. But it's really, I think the particular thing is getting at not this nebulous concept of discipleship, but how can we make some steps toward a concrete and really, in some ways, very practical sort of understanding and ordering of discipleship.
Well, I mean, you're a professor of theology, you're practicing Christian, you've got children. Are you seeing in your experience of church life and just in a broader culture, a real lack between people who are accepting Christ in some way or accepting the title of Christian and their formation?
Yeah. Be interested to hear what you're seeing in your context. I grew up in the South, and there's a lot of what we typically call nominal Christians, or kind of in name only. A lot of people who go to church, and that's a part of their just kind of, that's what I do. But it doesn't seem to make a sort of distinct difference in their life or in the way that they think about the broader culture, the common good, and that sort of thing. And then we lived for a couple of years in Vancouver, British Columbia, which is super secular, like 2% of the population goes to church. And so nobody there just kind of like accidentally goes to church, they don't just like stumble into a church kind of more haphazardly. So there's a bit more kind of intentionality that's I think going on there. And so one of the things that I think naturally emerges in contexts where there's not a really like thick Christian culture is that something like a catechumenate almost has to occur, where you don't have any sort of natural boundaries or bridges between non-Christian and Christian culture, for lack of better terms. You have to create some sort of bridge. Jerry Sitzer writes a lot about this idea of the catechumenate as a bridge between pagan and Christian culture, looking particularly at the early church, kind of 2nd, 3rd century, seeing that just when you have these two kind of, two different polarizing kinds of cultures, like to get from one to the other, it's not enough to just say, well, it's kind of like that. It's kind of like that. You basically know what this is, you know what it means. You know what we mean when we say Jesus is Lord and everyone's just nodding along. It's like, no, we never heard of the guy, totally unfamiliar with what you're talking about.
Yeah, in like a way, it's sort of, the complete lack of or maybe not a lack of, but like a more fully throated secular world in some way highlights some of the excesses we have in a Christianized world, right? We could just be culturally Christian. We can say, Jesus is Lord, not our heads, but do we really know what it means? Do we really live that? Whereas like in a more secularized space, you really do need to walk through explanatory, explaining what that means and looks like. I mean, you really
go back to square one and that's I think a good challenge for Christians, right? Like I think that's actually one of the unexpected sort of blessings of a secularizing age or whatever, is that it forces us to say, actually, do we know what we believe and why? And do we understand the sort of the roots and the logic of this thing that we'd be willing to die for?
Yeah. Well, we're sort of diving in, and I think maybe we kind of need to take a pause and just talk about the words, because you identified the fact that publishers don't like the word catechism, right? We put catechesis and catechumenate. What is that? I mean, I think that maybe people from a certain free church background might have seen a Catholic catechetical text on a bookshelf, might be familiar with Luther. But that's not the language they're hearing in typical everyday Sunday worship and gatherings. What does the word mean, and what is it driving at?
Yeah. The word comes from a Greek term, katēcheō would be the verb form of that. And it appears about 6 times in the New Testament. I think 3 in Luke, Acts. And it typically just means teaching or instruction. There's some people that think maybe it's got a specifically oral context, like, it's got some sort of verbal similarities to the word echo or acoustics. Like those are some of the similar kind of Greek root words in there. By about the 2nd century, it comes some of this verbal language takes on a more precise meaning of baptismal instruction. And the first sort of like, the word is still used fairly loosely in the early church, but a more specific meaning first is actually in the title catechumen. And this designates somebody who is learning the faith, but they're not yet baptized. So it's like almost an official title. You've got, by the time you get to Augustine, he'll distinguish between the fidelis and the catechumens. And these are both sort of members of the church.
Right.
So that becomes like, it's first a title, and then they'll still use like verbs to talk about catechesis as a kind of instruction or catechetical or something like that. They'll occasionally talk about a catechist, somebody's a teacher. It's more of a late, like 18th or 19th century. It's a much later term, but scholarship would apply the term catechumenate to describe the process of becoming a Christian. So this process of instruction. And then finally, the word catechism is just the word that we most know today, refers to a text. So Augustine will use the word catechismus. That's one of the first appearances of that term. But that term doesn't really sort of, catch fire until the Reformation. There's uses of it obviously way before that. But it really proliferates, and especially with the printing press. So you have this sort of like new technological medium that allows you to do more printing and publishing. And so that's the sort of like the age of the catechism is about 200 years from the 1600s to, mid 1700s or so. You've got just a huge proliferation of catechism writing. Even in places where there's only like one or two official catechisms, you'll have tons more that are happening, being published here and there. And then, so the reformers think they discovered this, they're like, the Roman Catholics have totally forgotten the practice of catechesis, and that's why the church is in this deplorable state. And so here we are, and the Catholics are like, we've been, they're like, we've had catechisms for centuries. Right. There's this huge sort of like renewal of pastoral education starting in the 1200s, 1300s, But then the Roman Catholic Church also answers this sort of catechetical emergence in the Reformation. And so at Trent, you've got three major catechisms, a kind of simple, medium, and higher level catechism that emerges at Trent in the 16th century. And then you see variations on this. And then in the 20th century, you've got lots of kind of different things happening. But the big things within the Roman Catholic Church are the promulgation of the RCIA, the Rites of Christian Initiation for Adults, after Vatican II. Wow. And then the catechism in the early 90s. So you have both of those things emerging that now in 2025, we just think, oh, that's a Catholic thing. And it's actually got a much more sort of deeply just reformational, Protestant and Catholic kind of heritage. You also, for all the free churches out there, there's actually tons of Baptist catechisms and such. So yeah, if you look, it doesn't take much these days to look for that history and see actually a pretty rich, catechetical tradition, even within more free church and especially Baptist context.
It's like this. It's this formation period or a focus on the formation into the Christian life. It's pretty established and thought through. And I think for a lot, we kind of smile a little bit thinking about the free church might not realize that it's already there. But I think when I take the language of catechism or even systematic structural education, to many people, they kind of sense it. I sense in them that they feel it's stuffy, rigid. I mean, churches are well known to make calls to faithfulness, maybe calls to baptism, depending on your tradition. But we're not seeing lots of Christian education I would even say Sunday school in certain church traditions is sort of waning, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And so, and I would suggest also that in a lot of churches, the sermon has become teaching and not preaching, right? That's just where they get their formation. But to see it structured in, especially the way a lot of catechisms are written in question and answer format, this seems sort of stuffy. Yet, at least my belief is, I think we yearn for it. We just maybe stylistically have changed the way we think about things. Like my evidence of this is that the people love the genre of text. I don't even know what it's called, but Jordan Peterson has a book called 12 Rules for Life, right? Yeah. You can find 1,000 books like that. Ethan Hawke, the actor, has a little book called Rules for a Night, right? Like these little rules for life. It's certain moral instruction or I don't know what 12 Rules for Life by Peterson would be called, if it's moral or self-help or whatever, but
but just like didactic, like telling you what to do, like clear, rigid. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Bushido, the Bushido code, like in jujitsu class where my son goes, they have this stuff written on the wall. People want instruction and of some way, some type. You're suggesting in your book that there's a lot of life to be found in some of the ancient forms of this, not just the contemporary modern ones. What's there? What's the treasure there that's in some of these ancient forms of didactic or educational offering?
Yeah. I think that's I think there's a lot there. I think part of it is the way that the early church. I did a lot of my early kind of research and writing on the development of catechesis in the early church, kind of 2nd through 5th century, roughly. And in this book, in Making Disciples, it's more about taking some of that but thinking more broadly about what we might do today. Yeah, I think there's something about returning to the early church, and my sort of approach to returning to the early church or retrieving the early Christian catechetical tradition is not so much to just imitate a kind of method that they did, like, oh, they did a 4-step method, and you become a pre-catechumen, then a catechumen, and then you're going through Lent, and then you go through mystagogy or something. Or like, oh, here's the content. We need to focus on the content, because it varies a lot. They focus on the creed and the Lord's Prayer, but other than that, there's like a pretty broad range of things that early Christians are using for catechesis in order to, say, instruct moral formation and that sort of thing. So it wasn't so much a method, and it wasn't so much like a set of texts that you have to cover. What was most instructive to me in looking to the early church was this sort of dynamic energy and ethos, the spirit, to use Wilkins' term, the spirit of early Christian catechesis. Robert Louis Wilkins has this great book, The Spirit of Early Christian Thought. So that's always stuck with me, is this sort of this dynamism, this energy that they approach catechesis with. They don't see the basics of the Christian life as something that's kind of boring and rigid and stale, and something that, we just need to get this, learn your math facts so you can go on to do algebra or something like that. They see what we call the sort of catechetical standards, the text, like the creed and the Lord's Prayer. They see the passing on of these texts as just laden with spiritual power. And so one never gets beyond the creed, or one never exhausts the Lord's Prayer. They see this with a different set of eyes, and they constantly see what's in these foundational texts as containing the sources of our ongoing life in Christ. So the place in which we can develop a really rich, spiritual maturity. So it's a different kind of epistemology, I think, too, would be another way to characterize that. Like I think kind of my very loose characterization of this, and again, I'd love to hear what you think about this, but my sort of, the way I see sort of a theological epistemology happening in modernity is one that cannot but live in this dichotomy between like the intellectual versus sort of affective. It's like, our Reformed friends are like heavy on the doctrine, and our evangelical friends are heavy on the piety and stuff. And it's this constant sort of like tension, this sort of battle. And I was kind of, I'd read, Jamie Smith's kind of Desiring the Kingdom books like years ago, and he draws heavily on Augustine. And so when I went to read Augustine, I went to read these catechists, I was expecting to find something like this sort of like, they're they're recovering this sort of, affective epistemology, or something like that. And you just, it's not wrong, but it's just not the way that they talk. They just don't live in modernity, in
Right.
which there's a sort of bifurcation of
Yeah.
what we would call the head and the heart now. So they just haven't learned that. They have different dichotomies, and maybe some of them are wrong or whatever. But like, I found it helpful. I found the patristic sources to be kind of like, I use the language of apprenticeship. I was like, these are people that I think I can learn the practice of catechesis from in a way that just hasn't absorbed some of the epistemological bifurcations of modernity.
Yes.
I find these to be trustworthy people with whom to think.
Yeah, thinking along the lines of what you're talking about. I mean, I always say that the church I grew up in taught me to love Jesus, and it taught me to love Scripture. But I had other conversions in my development, and even though I think the church of my childhood would say that something like the Bible is inerrant or infallible, or some formulation of those words that I don't tend to trade in those words any longer because of the modernistic connotations of those words. They certainly try to get me to take the Scriptures very seriously, but I learned to take them even more seriously when I started studying the Church Fathers.
Yeah.
And there's a sense in which I remember, and I was in seminary, I had this really great professor. He would ask the class, raise your hand if you know that God exists. And one or two people would raise their hand. And now he said, raise your hand if you believe that God exists. You would die for that, but you just can't say you know. And everyone else raised their hands. And he is illustrating for us this real challenge we have after the Enlightenment. He was talking about Kant. He was talking about Descartes. He was talking about Lessing. He was talking about all of these thinkers. He was just trying to show us that the issue for a lot of us is that word knowledge versus belief, right? And for a long time, I was very comfortable raising my hand and saying, I believe that God is, but I don't want to say I know, and I want to be intellectually honest and sincere. And then some point in my formation, I read of Bonhoeffer, someone describing Bonhoeffer, and they said that Bonhoeffer, it was very clear to them that there was no question for Bonhoeffer that Bonhoeffer knew that God exists, and without any sort of embarrassment of that. Now, I remember reading that and saying, boy, I really wish I had that more simple faith. And it really was a combination, and I feel like I'm closer to that now. And it's a combination of reading the Church Fathers, who are academically or intellectually far superior than most people realize, far superior than me. Yet they were also in love. They were in love with these images, and so the whole self's there. So I wanted to affirm that, and then there is something that you said earlier in your answer that made me think about something else. I just wanted to highlight. You're talking about this how catechetical work is not just boring and formulaic and state. I mean, some of these first few century Christians would prepare for baptism, and then the description is often are reported to be this way: that they would go into the water naked with a group of people on Easter Vigil, and they would make these prayers, and they would face west and denounce the devil and the devil's demons, and then face east where Christ will come from. And talk about somatic physical experience of
That's
conversion.
right.
Not just can you recite these three things that we right?
Yeah, and it's often preceded by a sort of intense period. This is where a lot of the traditions around Lent as an ascetical sort of season come from, is that it's preparation for Easter baptism. The participation in Christ's death and resurrection. And if that's what you're going towards, you can see this catechetical preparation as a training for death in some ways. In that way, it's very similar to some kind of monastic logics, this sort of preparation for death, the sort of stripping off of the old man, symbolized in the stripping off of one's literal clothes. And then they're clothed with white garments, right? They're clothed in sort of resurrection. That's a period of fasting, of blessings, of exorcisms. There's a series of exorcisms that will happen. They tell people who, if you're married, this is a season for abstinence. So like that's all, there's lots of, the sort of somatic or psychosomatic things that are happening there. And then again, to that point about the demonic, they're rejecting Satan and all his dominions, and then turning towards the East. That's this rejection of a cosmological allegiance,
Right.
and then this embrace. You're a participant in a new kind of kingdom now. So it really picks up more on this sort of cosmological dimensions that you see in some of the Pauline writings, this sort of being transformed, leaving the old kingdom, no longer being sort of enslaved to the idols, but being brought into as servants and then sons of the king. So again, it's just like when you step back and like look at a broad level, what's going on there. You're like, man, this is not Sunday school.
No. It's deep, and this is rooting ourselves in something that is truly life-giving and formative. There's a lot in your text that talks about catechism as being something that doesn't just inform us or teach us facts, but forms us in how we live. And I think that is one of the biggest concerns that I have facing Christian formation, catechesis today, is living into the age of artificial intelligence and the large language models.
Yeah.
I think that any good technology is worth being considered as a tool, and each tool is also it needs to be we need to be concerned that it doesn't become more than a tool, like it becomes a weapon or something destructive. I'm very concerned, as many are, about these large language models and what they will end up becoming for us. But I'm also concerned that I see people preparing Bible studies with too much ChatGPT reliance, and right, we can just go. I mean, I can just go there and I can get a lot of the material I can put Robert Jensen's catechism questions in there. I can put the Catholic Catechism question. I can look at Tim Keller. I can look at all these different thinkers, and I can get some nice stuff, no doubt. But that is not the same thing.
That's right.
Going through, right?
Yeah.
Any thoughts on how we might, as a people, tend to our own formation, and not succumb to the temptations of just input data in the
Yeah, in some ways we've been setting ourselves up quite poorly for that task for a while, so that the emergence of AI, in some ways, if we're thinking about education, learning as processing data, the accumulation of large amounts of data, and we think that the person who's the most educated, who is the person who has simply processed the largest quantity of data. Like, if we've sort of been learning that for a couple of centuries probably, and if that's where we are now, then we'll just think, yeah, well, you can do the same thing, and AI just does that better. If we, however, come to it with different assumptions about what formation is, such as, say, the soul being impressed with certain images, so that we're actually quite literally talking about the shaping of character, or the formation of character, if we're using those kind of craftsmanship metaphors to think about education and formation, then we're just going to start off on a very different foot when we're talking about catechesis. I looked at it's in one of the chapters. There's a chapter on the relational dimensions of catechesis, and there I draw a little bit on Albert Boardman in his technological critique. He uses that language of focal practices, What are the kinds of technologies? Like technology as such is inescapable, but as you were talking about, like what are these technologies not just doing for us, but doing to us?
Mm-hmm.
Then we're more prone to ask, in what ways are these technologies, say, isolating us from one another versus drawing us together? Borgman uses the example, draws on the language of focal from the word focus, which in Latin is just the hearth. So this is the hearth, the fireplace, the center of the home. And he contrasts that with central air conditioning. And he's like, what the hearth does, what the focal point of this, it draws people together. It's where cooking happens. It's where storytelling happens. It's where community is formed. And what central air conditioning allows us, and heating and air conditioning allows us to do, is we can all be in our own separate rooms and be perfectly fine. So it's not saying we should go back, or it's not a claim about going backwards or forwards. It's a claim to think more clearly about what is happening to our cultures, to our relationships, to our lives as we're engaging these practices. So if we think about catechesis as simply learning a text, or it's something you could learn on an app, or something you could look up with a chat catechist, if you think that is catechesis, then you would be more likely to be like, yeah, I can just learn this from AI versus actually learning the faith in relationship, being a part of a worshiping body of Christ, wherein I actually receive this living tradition from other human beings. And in that reception of it, I'm actually learning not just content, but learning the affections, the ethos, the ethics of the Christian way of life. So I think that's I've always kind of loved Borgman's writing about focal practices, but thinking about that in the context of catechesis and education in particular was really helpful for me in terms of how I've been thinking about some of these things.
Yeah, the way he describes, we are big Borgman fans around here, and the way he describes, like even the making of music, where you have focal reality of a piano and the focal practice of making music together, and now we can all have our devices in our rooms listening to music. That applies to the way we do spiritual formation as well. I mean, we could all just take our device or our books to our, by ourselves, or we can gather together around table.
Yeah.
And then hear from one another, which is infinitely different, or not infinitely, it's much different. I know that you're short on time today or we're drawing short on your time. I wanted to ask you very specifically that if you could wave a magic wand and make the church today, or just Christians in general today, reclaim a practice or narrow in on something that maybe is lost or overlooked, what would it be?
Yeah, I would love, with my magic wand, for every church to have a practice of catechesis that they consider as seriously as the rest of worship, such that catechesis was simply the normal operating life of the Christian church. One of the things that it comes together to do. It's not the only thing, and I wouldn't say it's the most important thing. I'd be one to say that preaching and the sacraments are the most important thing that a church does together. But at the same time, that doesn't mean everything else is simply adiaphora and you can kind of take it or leave it. I would love, though, if every church had this is what we do here at this church, like catechesis, a season of time, whether that's 6 months, a year, 2 years, 3 years, you have this distinct season so that the church is able to reclaim the teaching office that it's always had, but that we've now kind of seeded out to other kinds of institutions. We think education is the work of the school, or as you're saying earlier, we have to do all of the work of teaching within the more limited window of preaching. I would love for us to just have the freedom and the courage to embrace catechesis as an essential practice of the church's life again.
In your book, you talk a lot about how catechesis has waned in the Sunday school movement when we teach more Bible stories to kids. And I'm all for teaching kids Bible stories, but it seems to maybe have gone baby out with the bathwater. I mean, in some regards, we get story.
Yeah, like I'm all for story and narrative, and I mean, in the early church does this too. Like it's not just they were just teaching abstract principles. They used a lot of narrative, a lot of story. But at the same time, what they have is like what we were talking about earlier, a coherent framework for where all these things fit together. I think now the temptation is in a kind of like just Bible story only kind of model is like, well, you always have an implicit theology in those, but it often becomes not always what we think we're teaching.
Right.
It devolves into just kind of a moralism or sort of simple exemplarism kind of thing. Like, how can we imitate Noah in the ark? Or that sort of thing.
Right.
So, but it's certainly, I think it's quite possible to retain all the love of Scripture that I think is the best part of that tradition, and the just devotion to Scripture, but while also doing so within a coherent framework that actually embraces the doctrinal, the theological life of the church as well.
Wow, Dr. Fogleman, thank you. And if I could maybe challenge you with one more thing, your book, Making Disciples, Catechesis in History, Theology and Practice, it's a terrific book. Do you think you could summarize it just in a phrase or a sentence?
I use the phrase that this catechesis is the basic but comprehensive instruction in what Christians believe, hope, and love.
Haha, very good. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you. So good to be with you, Jarrod.